For Crema Media's Polity, I'm Sane Dhlamini, Minister of Cooperative Governance and Traditional Affairs and former ANC Treasurer Dr. Zweli Mkhize joins me to discuss 2019 elections. Welcome, Dr. Mkhize.
Thank you very much, Sane, and
Minister,
all your viewers.
Thank you very much for your time. Can you update us on what you have done to make sure that there are no issues, especially in KZN, because we know that the IFP has been calling for a government intervention instead of dissolving the Ingonyama Trust?
Well, Ingonyama Trust historically came from KwaZulu government, and then it was adopted as a law by the new democratic government. And that law basically confers ownership to Ingonyama. Ingonyama Trust, that's a kind of trusteeship of the land, which is largely the land which is under traditional leadership, as well as some of the townships. Now that issue it needs to be understood in the context that it's a transitional mechanism that we have to agree to, and in that process, it's the Ingonyama Trust board is actually a statutory entity, which is an entity of government. So by right, when there are issues, these are issues that the various departments, particularly land affairs, the issues of the Office of the Premier, Agriculture, and others, even Presidency, have to work together with that institution to try and resolve the issues as an internal in-house program of resolving challenges. We have been in touch with the Ngonyama Trust Board, we have been in touch with the KwaZulu-Natal government, and what we're working on is to try and find a way to resolve some of the contradictions that arise from the issues of who pays rates to who owns which land, how do we then develop the land, and how do we deal with proclamation in land which is under Ngonyama Trust, how does municipality access new land for expansion of services and economic and human settlement, and how do you make sure that between those two entities you are always able to find a harmonious way of dealing with the issue. That's the way to deal with it. Sometimes people get a little mistaken when they go out and create an impression that it's a standalone entity. It's actually under government. It reports to the Department of Land Affairs. All we need is to ensure that supervision, monitoring is tighter, and we also need to make sure that in the process the community's concerns are dealt with. Well, there are a number of issues that have been looked at. For example, some revenue accrues to communities for the development that takes place in those areas. That money is destined for developing those communities. Now we need to regularize the process of that money being repatriated to those communities. The issue of the decisions that are taken by communities in terms of what development needs to be taken, needs to be harmonized with all the departments that are involved. All of these things need to be managed on a day-to-day basis. And when we look at it, we sometimes think that we are dealing with standalone entities. It's not. It's all government stuff that can be resolved through internal intergovernmental relations framework so that we can deal with them. So we're going through those discussions between SCOCTA as the custodian of the IGR framework, so with the Office of the Premier, to try and make sure that we can resolve this. At the core of it is an issue which the country has not resolved, and that is the issue of how do we ensure the communal tenure rights for community or people, individuals, households who live in communal land. It's the same all over the country, even though in KwaZulu-Natal it seems to be an issue with Ngonyama. Actually, that's where the issue is. And the issue is about how to protect homesteads and households and families, so that whoever has got rights to land does not lose that right. Now it's a bit more complex, because for those families you always want to make sure that a woman-led household or a child-headed household does not get disadvantaged, not exploited. Sometimes there's bullying within families or within the traditional leadership. There could be those kinds of things. How do you protect them in law? So that's what we need to clear. There are issues, for example, of it's not just like in the township where the 4 poles will show you where your property is. In there, you've got a household which is generations of members of the clan. It's also, people who live there, but they live there in name, but they might be settled somewhere else, but they've got ownership or claim to that land. Then you've also got fields, which are communal. Then you've got commonage, which is communal. Then you've got graveyards, which are communal. All of these rights you cannot actually just, define by a simple title deed, because it might define you outside some of the stuff you have got rights to. So all of these issues are being discussed. Now, as we're discussing with the House of Traditional Leaders, the issues are being raised as well, as to how do we make sure that you can bring in, commercial investment into the area without causing community to be exploited by unscrupulous practitioners. How do you make sure that people can have land and release the land and get value as an asset without that being ultimately all bonded and taken over by banks and other financial institutions, loan sharks, etc. So those are the things that we have to tease out.
So the IFP is recently calling for an investigation following another death of a councillor in KZN. So can you briefly tell us if your department is worried about this and what are you intending to do?
Well, the death of councillors, officials in municipalities or in government, are completely unacceptable. And any death that's related to activities inside the municipal or government supply chain process is unacceptable. Any deaths are not acceptable. Now, I think what we then believe it's important for us is to fix all the issues that we have raised in terms of the weaknesses of the municipality. At the end, we also want to make sure that there's consequence management inside the municipality, so that some of the things that go wrong end up spilling up in some of these deaths. That means we've actually got an incursion of criminal elements into the procurement system, in the employment system, in the way municipalities operate. Now that needs to be stopped. And the way to stop it is to make sure that if there is any death, it's investigated and the consequences follow and people are charged, and that we must then be able to ensure that, there is a disincentive to actually committing crime within that space. Once we have got a very tight system of investigation and punishment to those who are involved, then everyone will think twice before they start getting involved. We have been very pleased to see that the police have gone all the way to bring perpetrators to book, and we really have been concerned about the rising numbers, because right now the number was almost 60 of councillors that have died since 2012. That number is very high. Now, we need to stop that. There's no way you can run a democratic system where someone in the process believes that you can use a shortcut of shooting somebody and killing them. We need to actually dismantle the whole machinery of hit squads, and we must also dismantle the financial flows to those hit squads, because there must be some irregular money that's paying them. All of that needs to be actually dismantled. And as far as we're concerned, we're getting closer to that process. Our department, on the one side, we're tightening up on the management of the internal investigations inside municipalities. So there will always have to be forensic investigations done, and then we have now got the legislation tightened up that the municipal public accounts committees, unpacks, must then look at the report within a certain period of time and act. If they didn't act, COGTA must then oversee the process and then demand action where there hasn't been, and therefore also pick up issues to higher levels of interventions if we think that criminal investigation is needed. So we need to tighten up the system. That system must never be allowed to get us to a point where there are people who will commit irregularities, there are no consequences, there are supply chains irregularities, there are no consequences, and then there are people who actually take advantage of that and start shooting at people who they think are obstructive inside the municipal system, and that there's no consequence to that. All of those things, we must have consequences on all of that.
And what is your department's response to the Contralessa's request that they want Abatebu King to be released before elections?
Well, that's a political request. It's a political demand. I think they're entitled to that. All I can say is that there are means and ways of being able to process requests for release. So there's some applications for presidential pardons, for parole, and so on. I think if they followed all of those issues up, we must allow the Justice Department to process them like they do with many others. If they are successful, of course, then they will be released. If they are not successful, I'm sure they'll explain what is the issue. But I think that the extent to which there's been concerns about it, it means that they should really get onto the processes and apply and see whether they could get that assisted. As a department of COCTA, would not have any objection to the release of the king if all those processes have been complied with. We believe that a lot needs to be done within the system of traditional leadership to make sure that criminal activities does not get tolerated, and that people must understand the rule of law, the constitution, and how an institution, a traditional leadership institution, which implements customary law, is actually part of the constitution of our country, and therefore there must be checks and balances to make sure that people know how to implement that system.
And how will you respond when Controlesa is demanding again for the restoration of powers of traditional leaders?
That's a discussion that's been going on for a while. The traditional leadership have raised a lot of issues. Amongst them is the issue of powers and roles and functions. Now that issue was raised when President Mandela, President Mbeki, President Kgalema Motlanthe, President Zuma, and now President Ramaphosa. It's an issue that's been on the table for a long time. And in the process, we as COCTA, we've been instructed by President to go into this matter. We've got a team that's gone into it, and we've actually identified a number of areas where we believe that the discussions of the traditional leaders and the department must focus on to. So there are issues, for example, where there's a definition of the role of traditional leadership in the constitution, in our democratic constitution. Now they would like us to look at that and amend that. So we said, okay, once we've got proposals, we'll have to process that and see what is possible there. Then there are issues that relate to the different sets of powers that they've got. So for example, the issues around local government powers that the traditional leaders have been involved in, those were actually replaced by the wall-to-wall municipalities. So it's no longer possible to define it in the same way. So there's a debate going on that side. But that matter was dealt with by President Mbeki way back in year 2000 in the response to the traditional leaders. There are a few other issues where the traditional leaders are involved. For example, the issues of their role in the land management as it is currently, that needs to be discussed. Particularly, they've got concern about what is called Special Planning and Land Utilization Management Act, SPLUMA. Now, that Land Use Management and Act, they would like a particular area to be discussed. Now, we've gone into a bit more discussion, and they've said, look, the planning side they are quite comfortable with. The side that's an issue is their roles when it comes to management of the issues and how to deal with issues of conflicts and so on. That now is being discussed. Then there are other areas where the traditional leaders are involved in other issues of economic activities. So what about mining issues, development of malls and commercial trading centers and so on. So we have to discuss how the communities participate at that kind of level as traditional communities, and making a distinction also between entrepreneurs. Sometimes some of the traditional leaders themselves are in their own right, as well as the traditional community as a community settled in that area. So we've gone through those discussions, and we're trying to get a kind of document that will bring these issues so that we can bring them up for decision making at the right levels. Now, in the process of discussing all of these issues, it's important for us to be able to indicate that there has to be an understanding that traditional leadership institution is actually part and parcel of our constitutional democracy. So the issue, for example, of settling of disputes and traditional courts and all of that are part of how you implement customary law. Now, that sector, that legislation has been passed, and part of the problem that has been delaying was the issue of protection of women in the traditional system. We've made sure of that in terms of them participating, but also in terms of the traditional leaders subscribing to the constitution, in which case they can't stand in a court and then discriminate against women or children, because the law is against it. So they must be able to understand, and of course there's good understanding now on that issue. So the other issues around decision making and land matters, a lot of decisions have come from constitutional court, where, for example, the court would strike down a decision by a traditional court on the allocation of land rights where they feel that the community may not have been sufficiently consulted. Now, we've raised this to the traditional leaders. They must be aware that in the context of African democracy, or historical kind of democracy from which customary law has evolved, that was basically a participatory process. So everyone would participate irrespective of whether their views were for or against the issue, right until the end, when at the end the traditional leader would sum up the issue. He would close the issue in the context of the view that best served the entire community. Hence, they would be called umlomo ngathethi, because by the time they pronounce, everyone's views has been taken into account. Now the courts have picked up on that to say, by the way, you can't just rule arbitrarily. You must produce evidence that the community in its diversity was consulted. And I think it's important, because when it comes to issues of land rights, mining rights, commercial rights in the commercial development in the various areas, there is the court is very sensitive to protecting communities' rights in those areas. So we are going through that process, and we hope that with time we'll be able to submit information on that.
Government has also been struggling to intervene in finding ways to end the tragic death of young initiates. Can you briefly tell us what the customary initiation bill is going to do in order to assist in this matter?
Yes, now this is an issue which has been very sad, very embarrassing for a democracy, because in the first instance, our democracy, our constitutional democracy, actually recognizes various traditions and cultural practices, but no cultural practice or tradition must be allowed to kill anyone. No one must die in the name of a culture. So whilst all the communities have got the right to practice initiations and so on, we have been concerned about the numbers of initiates who died. And when we looked at what was causing the deaths, we realized that a lot of it is a lot more of negligence in terms of probably poorly trained either surgeon or even the nursing maybe, and the subsequent poor monitoring of the hydration status or the health status of the initiates, and also the lack of ability to understand the medical condition that pre-exists before the initiation happens, which would have otherwise meant that it should not have been proceeded with, or it should have proceeded with particular caution. So we've actually now gone all out to engage the traditional leaders. They have actually opened up to us to say, by the way, we lay the blame on traditional leadership. In some of the areas where the problem is rife, it's not necessarily a uniform practice. It's families and clans that are running their own show. They choose the people who do the work, who are nurses, and they are the ones who provide the food, the shelter, and so on. When they fail to do that, of course, things go wrong, and it goes wrong in the name of a community when in fact it's a family that's been involved. But what we have said is that no, we need the traditional leaders to be involved directly, the medical practitioners to be involved directly, so that we must prevent anyone going to initiation who is not suitable, and we must also prevent anyone who complicates subsequent thereto from deteriorating until death. We also are trying to persuade as much as possible that there should be a strong medical surgical intervention in this case. Now, what we find to be an issue is that in some of the provinces, they've accepted that and is making a lot of progress. In some of the area, the stigma of deviating from the age-old customary initiation becomes a bigger deterrent for the initiative, so they avoid what is available, simply because of the stigma. Now, you can't cure the stigma with the medical doctors. You need to get the traditional leaders, the communities, to find a way to say to people, you're still acceptable even if these are the ways we have been, this thing has been done. There are actually instances where youth would have gone through a surgical circumcision and still go for the initiation. And then, of course, sometimes things complicate. So the bill now is supposed to assist to bring in more monitoring, more supervision, more taking of responsibility, and more action. Now, we've actually called on all of the instances where there have been deaths, that the police must investigate and charge them. They must be charged, because somebody's life has been lost in the context of a culture. Somebody must have done something wrong. We don't worry whether they actually take themselves to have been properly trained or not. If you've got a doctor where there's negligence and something goes wrong, then of course they must face the justice system. So that's exactly what we're doing. So we've got the interdepartmental team where social development is there, police, health, cooperative governance, traditional affairs, provincial, local, everyone, and NGOs. We want everyone to be there so that we can deal with it. Also, what is also a bit of a challenge which needs to also be managed is that some of our systems are very formalized, bureaucratic, but the system out there is very informal and traditional, and they're not properly aligned. So what you think is an obvious thing where you can go and make an advert on the radio, it doesn't work this side. You need a different system to send the information that will be consumed, and then people will be able to accept the benefit from that. So it's those kinds of things that we're dealing with. On most of the provinces where there's progress, there are a few provinces where we're struggling.
Thank you, Kabazela, for your time. That was Dr. Mkhize speaking to Polity about 2019 elections.